Dawn, September 14, 1942. Somewhere in the Kunite grass south of a jungle airstrip the Americans call Henderson Field, a Japanese major general crouches beside a radio operator and dictates a message he does not want to send. His name is Kiyotake Kawaguchi. 2 nights ago he commanded roughly 6,000 men, the finest jungle troops the Japanese army had left in the South Pacific. Now he is counting survivors instead of victories, and the number keeps getting worse. He does not put his despair in the message to 17th Army headquarters at Rabaul. Officers of his generation don't. But years later, reflecting on what happened on that ridge, Kawaguchi would settle on a single devastating phrase for what Guadalcanal had become for the Imperial Japanese Army. Site index equals 15-1, the graveyard of the Japanese Army /site. This is not the version of Guadalcanal you got in grainy newsreels, brave Marines, cowardly Banzai charges, and easy American win. This is the version written by the man who lost in his own hand on the ground where it happened. And to understand why a general with an unbroken string of victories behind him would use a word like graveyard, you have to go back to who Kawaguchi was before that ridge, and why he was so certain he would win. By September 1942, Kiyotake Kawaguchi was not some desk officer playing at war. He had been a soldier for nearly 3 decades, a graduate of the 26th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1914, and of the Army Staff College 8 years later. He had spent the interwar years in staff postings in China before taking command of the 35th Infantry Brigade in 1940. Then came the string of victories that made his name. In December 1941, his brigade splashed ashore across British Borneo, Miri, Kuching, Brunei, Jesselton, one coastal town after another falling to his reinforced brigade in a matter of weeks. By the spring of 1942, he had landed on Cebu, then Mindanao in the Philippines. On Cebu, in an episode that says something about the man, Kawaguchi objected loudly and to his own professional cost to the summary execution of defeated Filipino officials by a fellow Japanese officer, arguing that killing a beaten enemy in cold blood betrayed the samurai code he claimed to serve. It earned him a powerful enemy in the Japanese High Command, and some believed a deliberate reassignment to combat zones he wasn't expected to survive. So when the Kawaguchi detachment was ordered to the Solomon Islands in August 1942 to retake an airfield the Americans had stolen out from under Imperial Japan, Kawaguchi did not think of it as a gamble. He thought of it as the next entry in a career built on landing forces that always won. He was so confident, in fact, that when 17th Army offered him 1 additional infantry battalion to reinforce his attack, he turned it down. He believed there were only around 2,000 United States Marines dug in around that airfield. He was wrong by a factor of 6. The men waiting for him on that ridge did not exist as a unit 8 months earlier. In February 1942, with the United States reeling from Pearl Harbor and desperate for units that could hit back fast and hard, the Marine Corps Commandant, Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb, activated something new, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion. Command went to a quiet, unassuming lieutenant colonel with carrot-red hair and pale, unblinking eyes, Merritt Austin Edson, a man his troops nicknamed Red Mike, a name he'd carried since a red beard he grew fighting guerrillas along Nicaragua's Coco River in the 1920s, where he'd already earned a Navy Cross. Edson built his battalion the old-fashioned way, not through ideology but through selection and suffering, where his counterpart, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, built the 2nd Raider Battalion around Chinese-inspired egalitarian doctrine and the battle cry gung-ho worked together. Edson stuck to orthodox Marine discipline but pushed it to an extreme. He personally interviewed every volunteer. He ran his men on marches that stretched for dozens of miles, walking the column himself before jogging back to the front to lead it again. He drilled them in night fighting because his years in Nicaragua had taught him that the man who owns the dark owns the battlefield. He taught them to kill silently with wire and blade because he expected them to need it. What Edson could not have known was that everything he built his battalion to do, hold, adapt, and refuse to break in the dark, was about to be tested on a single stretch of high ground he'd never heard of, against an enemy who did not believe Americans had the stomach for it. By early September 1942, the pieces were moving into position for a collision neither side fully understood was coming. On the night of September 7th, 8th, and 9th, Edson's raiders staged a raid on a Japanese supply base at Tassimboko, on Guadalcanal's northern coast, destroying rice, ammunition, and radios, and crucially capturing documents that gave the Americans their first real look at the size of the force massing against them. It was far larger than anyone at division headquarters had guessed. Edson studied an aerial photograph of the terrain south of Henderson Field and picked out a single grass-covered ridge, a spine of high ground shaped, he thought, like a fishhook, pointing straight at the airstrip. His operations chief, Colonel Gerald Thomas, agreed it was the obvious avenue of attack. Division Commander Major General Alexander Vandegrift was skeptical. He thought the main blow would land elsewhere. but he let Thomas talk him into moving Edson's exhausted raiders and the battered remnant of the 1st Marine Parachute Battalion onto the ridge anyway, ostensibly just to wrest them out of the bombing pattern around the airfield. It was one of the more consequential accidents of the Pacific War. 900 tired men were about to be sitting, almost by chance, in exactly the place 6,000 Japanese soldiers were converging on. On September 12th, Kawaguchi's men, having force-marched through jungle so thick that entire units lost contact with each other, began arriving piecemeal at their jump-off positions east and south of the ridge. That night at 9:30 p.m., a Japanese cruiser and 3 destroyers opened up on the Marine lines for 20 minutes, lighting the ridge with searchlights. Kawaguchi's 1st Battalion, under Major Yukichi Kokusho, struck first, driving into the gap between the ridge and the Lunga River, overrunning at least one raider platoon in the chaos. It was a preview, not the main event. Much of Kawaguchi's force still hadn't reached the line. The Japanese pulled back at dawn to regroup for a second, coordinated night. Edson used the daylight hours of September 13th exactly as you'd expect a man raised on Nicaraguan jungle patrols to use them, improving positions, tightening the line, and preparing his exhausted men for what he already suspected was coming. That afternoon, he climbed onto an ammunition crate in front of his assembled raiders and parachutists and told them without embellishment what the next few hours would cost. "This is it," he said. There was no other unit to plug the gap if they broke. If they held, he told them, relief would come by morning. 400 exhausted men were about to hold an 1,800-yard line against an assault force more than 3 times their number. The story of that night is really the story of a dozen small, desperate decisions made by men whose names rarely make the history books outside a footnote or a medal citation. Take Major Kenneth Dillon Bailey, 31 years old, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, and raised from boyhood in Danville, Illinois, a University of Illinois graduate who'd once served as second in command of a college military honor society before he ever fired a shot in anger. By September 1942, Bailey commanded Company C of the 1st Raider Battalion, and he'd already been wounded once at Chilagi in August, earning a Silver Star for leading his men after taking a hit himself. On the ridge, when the Japanese punched a hole in the line near his company's position, Bailey took a severe head wound early in the fighting and simply kept commanding. For more than 10 hours of close, often hand-to-hand combat, a man with a fractured skull directed the defense of his sector, refusing evacuation until the position held. His Medal of Honor citation credits his conduct with helping repulse the attack and hold the airfield. It was awarded posthumously. Bailey survived the ridge only to be killed 12 days later on September 26, leading another attack along the Matanika River, a man too stubborn, it seems, to sit out the rest of a war he'd already nearly died fighting. Then there is Sergeant Keith Perkins, a machine gun section leader whose 2 guns anchored a stretch of the line that came under repeated Japanese assault. As his gunners fell killed and wounded around him one by one, Perkins didn't fall back to reorganize. He went looking for ammunition himself, running the position under fire, resupplying whichever gun was still firing. When the last gun's crew went down, Perkins took it up personally and kept firing it until he too was killed at his post. There's a kind of understatement in how the Raiders' own histories record it, not as heroics, but as simply what a section leader does when his guns are the only thing between the enemy and the runway. Not every story from that ridge is one of unbroken competence, and the honest ones aren't. Major Charles Miller, commanding what remained of the 1st Parachute Battalion, a unit already gutted by earlier fighting at Gavutu and Tanambogo, down from over 300 fighting men to barely 100, struggled that night to maintain effective control of his companies as Edson's orders came in amid the noise and confusion. It is an uncomfortable footnote in an otherwise heroic account, and it belongs in the story anyway because the ridge was not held by supermen. It was held by exhausted, frightened, competent on their best day human beings, some of whom rose to the moment and some of whom simply endured it. And there were NCOs whose names survive mostly in the recollections of the men who served beside them: Angus Goss, Walter Burek, Anthony Palinis. Hard-bitten raiders whose small, unglamorous acts of holding a fire team together in the dark rarely made it into an official citation, but without which no citation-worthy stand would have been possible at all. Accounts differ slightly on the particulars of that night, whose flank gave first, who plugged which gap, because there is no such thing as a single clean narrative of a battle fought in pitch darkness by men who could not always see the Marine 10 feet to their left, let alone the man they were shooting at. What makes Kawaguchi's own account of the fighting worth reading is that he did not simply blame bad luck. Japanese officers who studied the ridge afterward reached for something close to a psychological explanation for why their attack, textbook by their own doctrine, executed by veteran troops, had failed against a numerically inferior force. Japanese pre-war military thinking held to a concept sometimes rendered as Seishin Ryoku, spiritual power, the doctrine that sufficient willpower and offensive spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Fewer machine guns, less artillery, no air cover. It had worked brutally across Malaya, Borneo, and the Philippines against defenders who broke under the shock of a night assault. On the ridge, Kawaguchi's men came forward believing exactly that if they simply kept coming, wave after wave, the American line would eventually crack the way every other line had cracked. One Japanese officer describing the retreat afterward could not maintain the professional distance the moment called for. In a diary entry recovered by Marine intelligence from along the withdrawal route, he described marching for days without food, carrying wounded through mountain trails, watching untreated wounds fester with maggots, and simply being unable to stop crying at what he was seeing. It is not a document written by a defeated propagandist. It is a document written by a man watching a doctrine he'd trusted his whole career fail in front of him, at a human cost he had not been prepared for. The main assault came at 6:30 p.m. on September 13th, and by any measure it should have worked. Roughly 2,500 Japanese soldiers came out of the tree line in successive waves against fewer than 900 Marines strung along the ridge. Someone screamed a warning about gas that turned out to be smoke and confusion rather than chemical weapons, and in the panic and darkness, Japanese infiltrators actually got a man onto a Marine field telephone line. When Edson tried to reach the company on his right flank, a strange, oddly formal voice answered instead in accented English, reporting that the situation there was excellent, a Japanese soldier apparently attempting to buy time by pretending to be an American radio man. Edson wasn't fooled for long. He grabbed a corporal with a parade ground voice, sent him forward, and had him bellow across the gap for the real company to pull back, which it did, just ahead of being overrun entirely. Company by company, the Marine line bent backward toward Edson's command post on a rise called Hill 123, until the defenders were compressed into a horseshoe barely 1,000 yards from the end of the runway. This was the moment, the single hinge point of the entire campaign for Guadalcanal, when a general with doubts about the outcome anywhere else on the island had his gravest doubts here. Vandegrift himself later admitted that Kawaguchi's assault on the ridge was the only time in the whole campaign he genuinely feared the result. Had it succeeded, he said, the Americans would have been in serious trouble. What broke the Japanese assault in the end wasn't heroics alone. It was steel. Forward observers from the 11th Marines began walking 105mm howitzer fire down almost on top of Edson's own lines, shells landing as close as 200 yards from Marine foxholes, a distance any artillery officer will tell you is close enough to kill your own men if the math is off by a fraction. The guns fired nearly 2,000 rounds that night. Combined with the raiders' and parachutists' close-range fire, bayonets, pistols, and grenades in the final yards, the barrage finally did what rifle fire alone hadn't. It stopped the waves from reforming. By 4 a.m., Japanese units exhausted by 3 days without proper food or sleep began falling back in disorder. At first light, Marine fighters took off from the very airfield the Japanese had come to seize and strafed the retreating columns in the open ground beyond the ridge. When the Marines counted the dead that morning, they found more than 600 Japanese bodies on and around the slope. Some accounts, factoring in the wounded who died during the retreat, put total Japanese losses above 1,000. American losses were roughly 40 killed on the ridge itself, with total casualties across the battalion, dead, wounded, and missing, numbering close to 250 by the time the fighting fully ended on the 14th. 2 Medals of Honor came out of that ridge, Edson's and Bailey's, along with 19 Navy Crosses, 5 of them posthumous. Kawaguchi did not stay to see his brigade rebuilt. Relieved of his combat command the following month during preparations for yet another failed attempt to retake the airfield, he was evacuated back to Japan and placed on the reserve list in 1943. His war did not end quietly. Recovering from a long illness, he was given a defensive command on Tsushima Island in the war's final months. When Japan surrendered, Kawaguchi was sent to the Philippines to face a military tribunal, not for anything that happened on the ridge, but for war crimes tied to his earlier command on Mindanao. There's a bitter irony buried in that trial that even Japanese officers of the era noted. This was a man who had once risked his career objecting to the execution of defeated Filipino officials by a fellow officer, standing trial years later for atrocities under his own command elsewhere. He pleaded guilty and served 6 years in prison, released in the early 1950s. He died in Japan in 1961, having outlived nearly every man who fought under him on that ridge. What he left behind wasn't a manifesto or a justification. It was that one phrase offered decades later without self-pity to a journalist asking what Guadalcanal had actually meant. Not a defeat among other defeats, not a single lost battle in a long war. Site index equals 15-1, the graveyard of the Japanese army/site, the place, he said, where the myth that Western soldiers would simply fold under pressure finally permanently died. There is a ridge on Guadalcanal that the Americans who fought there never called Bloody Ridge. They called it Edson's Ridge, after the quiet, red-bearded colonel who told them there was only them between the airfield and the enemy, and who was right. A graveyard is what Kawaguchi called it, and a graveyard is what it became, for a doctrine that trusted willpower over firepower, for an assumption that courage alone could substitute for artillery, for the idea that 2,000 poorly informed guesses about enemy strength could stand in for reconnaissance. It was a graveyard for the belief, carried unbroken from Borneo to Cebu to Mindanao, that the next landing would go the way every landing before it had gone. It was not a graveyard for the 900 men on that ridge, though it very nearly was. It was instead the place where a hastily formed battalion of volunteers, selected on interviews and endurance marches less than a year earlier, held a line 4 times too long on one of the worst nights of their lives, because a man on an ammunition crate told them there was no one else to do it. The graveyard of an army is not built by the side that loses the most men. It is built by the side that loses its certainty. Kawaguchi's army lost that certainty on a nameless jungle ridge in the second week of September 1942, and it never fully found it again.